Thank you. Thomas, my co-author, and I are very happy to be here, honored to be here, really. And we want to thank the study group for Marxism for this invitation. And in particular, we want to thank Miguel and Inez, who we met in Paris, who invited us here, and Joanne and Patricia, who made all the arrangements for our flight and hotel, etc. And I'd like to, since this is the last session, I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking all of these organizers for putting this conference together. Thank you. And I'd also like to thank Francisco Mello, the editor of Vertice, I think, and, who is responsible for having our book translated and published in Portugal about 6 years ago. In 1974, I was in a bar in New York with the woman who would become my wife. This was our second date. And we were watching the TV, and I said, look, there's a revolution going on in Portugal. I said, why don't we go? And she said something more or less like, I barely know you, and you want me to go to a revolution in Portugal? Forget about it. Well, now we've been married 40 years. We have 2 kids. She knows me a little better, so when I invited her to come with me this time, she came. Oh. So, thank you. Better late than never to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the revolution. Today I'm going to do 2 things, and Thomas will do 1 thing. I want to take about half my time to talk about the book, summarize the book. But then it occurred to me when I was putting these thoughts together, well, this book has been published in Portuguese. Probably many people have read the book, and so I don't want to just come and rehash the book for people who've already read it. So what I decided to do was to take this opportunity to slam back at my critics, our critics. So the second part of the talk, I'd like to deal with 2 criticisms that have been made of the book and our response to them. And then I'll turn the floor over to my colleague, and he'll give another slightly different take on our book. He'll talk about 2 recent trips we've made to Cuba and how examining the Cuban reforms going on now kind of reinforce what we've said about the collapse of the Soviet Union. Well, just 10 years ago, we published Socialism Betrayed. And in our opinion, the question of why the Soviet Union collapsed remains maybe the most important question of the 20th century. Well, why do I say it's such an important question? Because since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, we've faced an avalanche of interpretations by conservatives, liberals, social democrats about why the Soviet Union collapsed. And the gist of much of this explanation by conservatives and liberals and social democrats is that the Soviet Union collapsed because socialism failed. In some of these interpretations, it's because socialism itself is incompatible with human nature. And that in any case, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, what's been shown is that capitalism is the highest form of civilization. It's the end of history. There is no kind of social formation after capitalism. Now, an entire generation of people have grown up since 1991 with no direct experience with the Soviet Union, including, I might say, probably the organizers of this conference were in a grade school when the Soviet Union collapsed. So many people do not know that this interpretation is really the exact opposite of the case, that the Soviet Union did not show that a centralized planning and a socialized property failed. They were a success, a resounding success, particularly from the point of view of working people. A centralized planning, socialized property from 1928 to 1988 in the Soviet Union provided sustained economic growth every single year except during World War II. Every single year, the Soviet Union grew faster than every other country in the world except Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. Not only that, but the Soviet Union provided unprecedented benefits to its people. What many people born or grown up since 1991 do not know or have forgotten is that the Soviet Union provided full employment, free medical service, free health care, paid vacations, month-paid vacations, guaranteed pensions, maternity leave with pay, free education through college with stipends for students, etc., etc. From the point of view of working people, no society in the world has made such a tremendous advance for its people in such a short period of time as the Soviet Union did between the revolution and the 1980s. And of course, on top of that, it ended a whole system of exploitation, of people making money by exploiting other people through rent, speculation, and exploitation. Well, of course, this presents a problem. If the Soviet Union was such a success, why did it collapse? Well, the short answer to this question is it collapsed because of the policies pursued by its leaders, particularly Mikhail Gorbachev after 1985. But this requires a little explanation. The Soviet Union was very successful, but it wasn't a utopia. The Soviet Union had problems, many problems. For example, just let me mention a couple. We discuss more in the book. But of course, there was the problem of the threat and the of imperialism, which never ceased to exist through the entire history of the Soviet Union. It meant economic boycotts, sabotage, invasion, etc. The Soviet Union was never free of these threats. It meant that they had to devote a considerable amount of resources to trying to obtain military parity with the United States to protect itself. It meant 20% at maximum of the Soviet gross national product had to be devoted to the military. It meant half of all money in research and development went to the military. It meant the best minds in science and technology had to go to the military. Well, it was understandable, but of course this put a strain on other parts of the socialist system. And of course these threats increased with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, when he pursued the Reagan Doctrine, which was to increase military spending, and as one of his advisors said about the Soviet Union, spend them into bankruptcy. He doubled the US military budget, started Star Wars, etc. Then the Soviet Union had economic problems. While the Soviet Union had grown steadily since 1928, by the 1980s, that growth had slacked off a little bit. It wasn't as great as it was earlier. This is a problem. There was a problem of inefficiency, of the lack of sufficient quantity and quality of goods, the lack of initiative from below, etc. These were ongoing problems that the Soviet Union had to face, as have other socialist countries. There was a problem of what we could call political stagnation. For 17 years, between 1964 and 1981, the leader of the Soviet Union was Leonid Brezhnev, and he pursued a policy called stability of cadre. What this meant was that leadership didn't change hands. Not only did Brezhnev stay at the top for 17 years, but most other people stayed in their positions. This meant a kind of a lack of new blood and new ideas. So when Yuri Andropov came to power in 1981, I think he correctly said, we have a political crisis here. Things haven't changed enough. Our ideology is out of step with reality, etc. Our party has become formalistic and not a leader of the people. We have to make some changes. So these were some problems that the Soviet Union faced. Threats from imperialism, economic problems, this political stagnation. But what we argue in the book is that none of these problems, alone or together, caused the collapse of the Soviet Union. What caused the collapse of the Soviet Union was Gorbachev's attempt to deal with these problems in a way which I'll discuss in a second. In other words, the patient wasn't killed by the disease, it was killed by the medicine. It was killed by the treatment. Well, what was the essence of Gorbachev's approach to dealing with these problems? The essence of Gorbachev's approach was to solve the problems of socialism by making concessions to capitalism, making concessions to imperialism, and trying to adopt capitalist ideas to cure socialist problems. That would be the shortest way to say it. We elaborate on this in the book. Let me give you a couple of examples. In the threat from imperialism category, Gorbachev made unilateral concessions for which he got nothing in return. This was a complete departure from past Soviet diplomacy. Let me give you an example, maybe you'll recall. Under Reagan, the American foreign policy came up with the idea of promoting the zero option. Even Reagan's advisors later admitted that they didn't expect anybody to take this idea seriously, but they put it forth so Reagan had something to say that he was for peace. But the idea was a preposterous one, preposterously one-sided, that it called for the Soviet Union to withdraw its intermediate missiles from Eastern Europe, and in return the US would not put intermediate missiles in Western Europe. In other words, the Soviet Union was supposed to give up something and the US would give up nothing. A preposterous idea which Gorbachev agreed to. In Afghanistan, where the Soviet Union had been fighting under Brezhnev, under Andropov, under Chernenko, in defense of a revolutionary government in Afghanistan, Gorbachev gave up that support and pulled out and got nothing in return. The US didn't agree to give up its largest CIA post in the world in Afghanistan. The US didn't agree that Afghanistan would become a neutral country. No, Gorbachev got nothing, a unilateral concession without anything in return. In terms of the economy, Gorbachev began by doing some reasonable things that Andropov had started, that is, trying to increase production and productivity by injecting more technology and more managerial expertise, trying to overcome inefficiency in the economy. But very quickly he moved from that to trying to incorporate certain capitalist ideas, bourgeois ideas, into the Soviet economy, decentralizing things, putting factories on a profit basis and trying to increase competition, etc. And very soon after that, moving to dismantle centralized planning and institute first cooperatives, which were a guise for private enterprise, and then private enterprise, and eventually allowing foreign investment. And within 5 years, these ideas had completely wreaked havoc on the Soviet economy, causing a depression, unemployment for the first time, and the turning over of ownership to mafioso and to foreign capitalists. In the political sectors also, Gorbachev started out reasonably, kind of carrying out Andropov's ideas on trying to revitalize Soviet politics, but calling for glasnost and opening up of the Soviet media, but very soon he was enamored with kind of bourgeois ideas of turning the Soviet media into a kind of idealized bourgeois independent media, which would act as a critic of Soviet society. And soon after that, the media was actually turned over to people hostile to socialism, anti-communist, and then soon after that, the Soviet Party was not just removed from the media, but was removed from other aspects of Soviet life until by the late 1990s, the multinational state itself was disintegrated and the Communist Party was disintegrating. Well, why was Gorbachev able to get away with this? Why was he able to pursue this disastrous path? How come he wasn't stopped? The Soviet Union had faced great or greater challenges in the past. Foreign invasion, threats from opportunists like Bukharin, from opportunist policies like Gorbachev, or like Khrushchev, and they've overcame these policies in the past. Why couldn't they overcome Gorbachev? Well, what we argue in the book is that the Soviet Union had subtly but significantly changed since the overthrow of Khrushchev in 1964. That what had developed in the Soviet Union was what we call, and others call, a second economy alongside the socialist economy. By a second economy, we mean a private enterprise economy, a private where people owned things in private, they ran things for private profit. Of course, to have a second economy, a private economy, and a socialist economy meant one thing. This could only happen by stealing time and stealing resources from the socialist economy, because most private enterprise in the Soviet Union was illegal. So to the extent that private enterprise existed, it had to exist by leeching on and being parasitic on the socialist economy, stealing time, stealing goods, reselling it. Well, this second economy grew steadily. It probably always existed more or less in the Soviet Union. Where there's shortages, there will be black markets, but it really took off under Khrushchev, and after Khrushchev, in fact, you can draw a steady graph of the increase of the second economy. By the end of the Brezhnev years, there were entire factories that were part of the second economy. There were a whole petty bourgeois class of people developed in the Soviet Union, sometimes called Brezhnev millionaires, based on this second economy. Well, the thing is that this second economy had very deleterious effects on socialism. In the first place, when you have, and by the way, by the middle of the 1980s, perhaps 25%, as was said earlier in the conference, the Soviet economy was based in this private secondary economy. So this makes planning very difficult. This makes things difficult for the socialist economy when this much of the economy is falling outside the planning system. But not only that, it meant the creation of this class of people, if you will, a kind of a petty bourgeois class of people whose interests resided outside of socialism, whose interest resided in making money and wanting to make more money and wanting to be able to do this legally and spend it legally. And it also meant the corruption of the Communist Party, because you cannot have a second economy in a socialist country unless you corrupt the party and corrupt the state. Everything that's stolen has to, these could be shut down in a second, right? They're all illegal. Somebody has to be paid off. So a whole sections of the Communist Party and of the state were implicated in this second economy as well. So what this meant then was a kind of a social base in the party and outside the party was created to support the kind of bourgeois ideas that Gorbachev began articulating and pushing after 1986. So that then is the essence of our argument, kind of bare bones. That socialism was not a failure, it was a success. But it had problems. And when Gorbachev tried to deal with these problems by making concessions to capitalism and imperialism, he took what were little problems and made them into a major crisis that destroyed socialism. That's basically our argument in bare bones. Now, since our book came out 10 years ago, it's been subjected to a number of criticisms. And I'd like to deal with two of these criticisms, two that I think are quite popular and quite prevalent. The first criticism is that our book ignores a deep problem in socialism. By the way, these are all criticisms that come from the left. They're not bourgeois criticisms. They're from people who consider themselves communists, basically, or at least socialist. That our account ignores a deep cause of the Soviet collapse. And that deep cause is that the productive forces in the Soviet Union, or in Russia at the time of the revolution, were too undeveloped to sustain socialism. And that this backwardness ultimately doomed the socialist project. Kind of a corollary of this idea, two corollaries, is that socialism could only have really survived in the Soviet Union if the Soviet Union had pursued the NEP, the new economic policies, which existed in the Soviet Union from about 1922 to 1929, which allowed certain forms of free enterprise to exist. So the argument is, if the Soviet Union had followed this course, had continued to follow the NEP and allow private enterprise to develop in the Soviet Union, and then it might have been able to move to socialism. A second corollary of this backwardness thesis is kind of related, which is that what the Soviet Union should have done is follow the Chinese course. It should have followed a market economy with a socialist orientation, like the Chinese have done, and that way they could have avoided a collapse. Now, I mean, I think it must be said, this is not a stupid idea. It's not a stupid idea that the Soviet Union was backward at the time of the revolution. Marx and Engels expected and hoped, I guess, that a revolution would occur in the most advanced countries. In 1918, Karl Kautsky said Russia was too backward to support socialism. In 1875, Engels had written an article on the backwardness of Russia. And even Molotov, one of the great leaders of the Soviet Union, said at the end of his life, well, you know, the backwardness that we faced adversely affected our development of socialism. So it's not a stupid idea. It's true that if the Soviet Union, if Russia had been an advanced country and they could have moved immediately to socialize these advanced forms of production, things would have been easier. They wouldn't have had to do this forced march to industrialization. You force anybody to go on a forced march, you're going to make opposition to yourself. The Soviet Union, Soviet leaders made opposition by having to do this forced march in the 1930s. Where there's backwardness, there's going to be shortages. Where there's shortages, there's going to be black markets. This happened. Backwardness creates problems. There's no question about it. But think for a second. Let's say the Soviet Union hadn't been backward. Let's say it had a very developed society at the time of the Russian Revolution. Well, that would have created other problems, of course. If it had advanced productive forces, had many factories, of course it would have had many more capitalists. And those capitalists would have opposed socialism. So there was a whole other range of problems that the Soviet Union might have faced. But in any case, let me just mention one other idea in passing. I mean, while Engels had talked about how backward Russia was in 1875, it's good to recall it wasn't quite that backward in 1917. That still about 90% of the people were peasants, but still 10% of the people were workers, and it had some of the largest factories in the world. But there are three other, it seems to me, main problems with this backwardness thesis. The first is that Russia might have been backward in 1917, but it didn't remain backward. It had great natural resources, it had a talented leadership, it had a motivated people, and it overcame this backwardness, or was in the process of overcoming this backwardness steadily. So it had gone from a very backward peasant country in 1917 to the second industrialized country in the world by 1980. 60% of the U.S. GDP was represented by the Soviet Union. I mean, the Soviet Union was at the level of 60% of the U.S. Moreover, if you look at 3 studies of the Soviet Union that came out in the 1980s, just at the time when the Soviet Union was about to collapse, you find some surprising results. An American economist named Harry Schaffer studied the Soviet economy and concluded, yes, the Soviet Union was still behind the US, but it was steadily gaining on the US and would soon overtake it. This Schaffer wrote in 1984. In 1989, another American named John Kaiser studied Soviet technology. He concluded that the idea that there was a technology gap between the Soviet Union and the US in the 1980s was preposterous. He said that this was a product of anti-Sovietism, that Americans simply couldn't believe that the Soviet Union was doing so well, that they were having breakthroughs in metallurgy and chemistry and food processing and biomedicine and in space technology, of course. And at the same time, in 1986, the CIA did a study of computer technology. And their study of Soviet computer technology was that there was a gap in 1986, but the Soviet Union was making rapid progress, and within a few years would have computer technology comparable to the best American computer technology. This does not seem like a formula for explaining the Soviet collapse. The Soviet Union was overcoming its backwardness. If anything, it suggests that it gave a certain motivation to the imperialists and to the CIA to strangle the Soviet Union while it could, because in the next few years it would catch the US economically and in terms of computer technology, etc. So this idea is not particularly persuasive. Also, by the way, at the very time when Soviet backwardness was being overcome, the black market was increasing. If you take this underdevelopment explanation, this is not what you would expect, right? They think that the backwardness was a problem and that the black market was simply an adjunct problem to backwardness. But what the figures show is that the black market had a life of its own by the 1980s. It wasn't dependent on Soviet backwardness. The second problem with this backwardness explanation, it seems to me, is that it's based on the assumption that continuing the new economic program in the 1920s, the NEP, was a live option, that this really would have been the way out for the Soviet Union. It reminds me of certain American historians who used to say, you know, what should have happened in America in the 19th century is that they should have just allowed slavery to exist, and it eventually would have died out peacefully. There was no need for the Civil War. This was particularly appealed to those people who wanted to blame the abolitionists for the bloody Civil War. But most historians today do not think that allowing slavery to exist, and it would have soon died out, was really a viable option for various reasons. That simply was not on the historical table. In the same way, allowing the NEP to continue to exist, I don't think was as viable as many people like Stephen Cohn and others and Bukharin at the time thought. The great Soviet historian, British Soviet historian, E.H. Carr, pointed out to a number of problems created by the NEP that grew worse in the 1920s. At the beginning of the NEP, there was what he called a scissors crisis, and where wildly fluctuating agricultural prices caused food shortages and unemployment. And then by the late 1920s, falling agricultural prices caused peasants to hoard food and led to starvation in the cities. And third, he points out that it became increasingly clear to Soviet leaders that to continue with the NEP would consign the Soviet Union to a protracted period of undevelopment, and at a time when the enemies of the Soviet Union were becoming more threatening. This was a fearsome and unacceptable prognosis. The situation that Bukharin, that they should have just done nothing, reminds me of the old story, you know, of the two prisoners who were condemned to be executed in the morning. And one of them said, "I think we should try to escape." And the other one said, "No, it'll only make matters worse." Well, I think that was kind of Bukharin's position, you know. Can't do anything, it'll only make matters worse. But the situation they were in was untenable. The third problem with the backwardness interpretation of the Soviet collapse is this idea that what the Soviet Union should have done was follow the Chinese path. The interesting thing about this argument, and this argument has been made, is that not even the Chinese make this argument. The Chinese don't think the Soviet collapsed because they should have followed the Chinese path of a market economy with a socialist orientation. They think the Soviet Union collapsed because of the bad policies of the Soviet leadership. Actually quite close to our argument, although articulated after our book. I don't think they read our book, but. So not only do the Chinese think that this was not a correct understanding of the Soviet collapse, but also it's not clear, really, that the Chinese path represents the golden road to socialism, right? It's just not that clear yet. At the very least, this remains an open question. The New York Times reported last month that because of the entanglements of the Chinese economy with the world market, Chinese growth has been less than at any time in the last decade. For the last decade, the Chinese economy has had persistent unemployment, at least 8% unofficial unemployment. And moreover, to sustain and achieve the levels of growth that the Chinese have achieved, it has meant turning increasingly large amounts of their economy over to foreign investors. Between 1990 and the early 2000s, the amount of foreign investment in China has gone from about 2% to 30%. Those are the latest figures I could find. It's probably even greater than that today because foreign investment has been greater in China than any place else in the world except the United States. Moreover, as a recent, let's see if I could find my quote. As a recent study of China has pointed out that there are increasing problems associated with this Chinese path. Not only growing unemployment, growing inequality, the erosion of health and education benefits, the growing oppression of women, and the multiplication of environmental crises. So this, it seems to me, very much weakens this backwardness argument. Let me just take maybe 10 more minutes and I'll deal with this second criticism that's been made of our book. And that is, some critics of our book are appalled by the way we handle Stalin. I think they would not be content unless we completely subscribed to what Domenico Lasordo calls the legend noire. That is, they think a fatal flaw of our book is that we don't condemn Stalin's cruelty. Well, one is tempted to reply to this criticism as Lenin replied to his friend Maxim Gorky, the writer Maxim Gorky, when Gorky questioned revolutionary violence in the early 1920s. Lenin said, "What do you want? Is it possible to act humanly in a struggle of such unprecedented ferocity? Where is there any place for soft-heartedness or generosity? We are being blockaded by Europe. We are deprived of the help of the European proletariat. Counter-revolution is creeping like a bear on us from every side. What do you want? Are we not right? Ought we not to struggle and resist? We are not a set of fools. What is your criterion for judging which blows are necessary and which are superfluous in a fight? What is your criterion for judging which blows are necessary and which are superfluous in a fight? Well, like I said, that's what I'd like to say to some of our critics who think that we should get on our moral high horse. What is the truth of the matter is that we did not try to make an assessment or write a biography of Stalin. We tried to explain the Soviet collapse. We dealt with Stalin, as any historian does, only as it related to our main question. Now, there are some critics who think that we've underestimated the role of Stalin in the Soviet collapse. They think, actually, that Stalin was more responsible for the Soviet collapse than Gorbachev. Now, anybody familiar with the historiography of Stalin will not be surprised by this idea. Stalin's been blamed for just about every calamity that's occurred in the 20th century. It's no surprising that somebody would blame the Soviet collapse on them, even though he died some 40 years before the Soviet collapse. But this is the argument. The argument is that Stalin's authoritarianism, and by what is meant by Stalin's authoritarianism is that the cult of the individual personality, the subjugation of all political activity or social activity to the control of the Communist Party, and the subordination of all ideological and scientific and cultural thinking to the political correctness of the party, that all of this had a stifling effect on the Soviet Union. To use the words of our critic, that Stalin's, what they call a Stalin deformation, demobilized and demoralized the Soviet people. And because of this demoralization and demobilization, that this stifled initiative of the Soviet people stifled responsibility, and all of this kept the Soviet economy from realizing its potential, ergo the collapse. Now, with the backwardness idea, this idea is not completely stupid. There are elements of it that would have to be sorted out. As we say in an article elsewhere, clearly, when you have a lot of repression, it's going to have negative consequences, and there was a lot of repression in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. It's going to have negative consequences. Let's see, I kind of lost my train of thought there for a second. Let's see. But the, let's back up. Yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you. I needed that word there. It seems to me that the, I know what I was going to, and plus it seems to me, I mean, we just came back from Cuba, that this problem of initiative from below and responsibility from below is an inherent problem of socialism. That is, whenever you have centralized planning with directives coming down from the top, you're going to have a problem with stifling initiative and responsibility from below. The Soviet Union had dealt with this problem before. Cuba has dealt with it before, and they're trying to deal with it again now. It's a problem. Doesn't mean that necessarily brought down the system, but it is a problem. So, it seems to me to lay this at Stalin's doorstep, that's a mistake. This is an inherent problem of centralized planning. It's not simply something that derived from Stalin. Plus, the other problem, it seems to me, with this blaming Stalin for the collapse, is that it takes a very one-sided reading of Stalin's authoritarianism. I mean, Stalin led a complex country over a long period of time through a number of crises. He was a very complicated guy himself, and he left a complicated legacy. That legacy is no less complicated when it comes to democracy and authoritarianism. And those who want to blame Stalin for the collapse are just looking at one side of that legacy. There is, believe it or not, a democratic side to Stalin's legacy as well. Let me just point to 3 examples. In 1936, the Soviet Union put forth a constitution. But what's interesting is the way they put forth a new constitution. This involved 2 years of nationwide discussion about the meaning of socialist democracy, the first time such has ever occurred in the world. It reminds me of what is going on in Cuba today as they discuss their reforms. After this 2-year discussion, the Constitution was put to a referendum. And that Constitution, though in many ways it failed to live up to its promise, because as soon after it was passed, the Soviet Union was involved in the throes of a life and death struggle against Nazi Germany, but nonetheless, that Constitution had rights that no other constitution in the world had, economic rights. People were guaranteed the right to employment, the right to paid vacations, month-paid vacations, the right to pensions, the right to health care, the right to free education, the right to sexual equality, including pay equality, the right to maternity leaves with pay, the right to aid for mothers of large children and unmarried mothers, the right to nursery schools, et cetera, et cetera. This was entirely new. A second aspect of Stalin's democratic legacy, you might say, was also related to the 1936 Constitution, was the way nationalities were treated. In the Soviet Union created something like 12 new national regions and thousands, literally thousands of national territories. And each of these regions, the national language became the official language. In many cases, the Soviet Union had to create a written language where one did not exist. It meant taking people from all of these previously oppressed nationalities, educating them and training them and putting them in positions in education, in government, and in industry. It meant that the Soviet Union sponsored in these languages books, newspapers, magazines, operas, movies, theaters, folk music, etc., all paid for by the state, and it was an affirmative action program unsurpassed by any. One historian named Terry Martin said the Soviet Union was the first affirmative action empire. In any case, no country before or since has managed to accomplish this kind of democratic rights for national minorities. The third democratic aspect of Stalin, I would point out, is kind of ironically the repression itself of the 1930s, particularly 1937. We forget that this repression was accomplished or accompanied by a democratic upsurge in the Soviet trade unions. Yes, to fulfill the promises of the 1936 Constitution, the party led or promoted a democratic upsurge in the trade unions to get rid of corrupt leadership, to root out oppositional elements, and to break up what they called leadership cults. People that were stealing money from the trade union funds, or that were disrupting production and were disrupting the delivery of social services. In this 1 year period, 1,200,000 people were elected to trade union office in the Soviet trade unions. And depending on the category, the number of new people elected ranged from 60% to 90%. Now, many of these trade union leaders who were found guilty of corruption were subsequently punished. The historian Wendy Goldman says this is an example of democratic repression. She said the idea that repression in 1937 was inflicted on the Soviet Union from above, said, is misleading. She said the Soviet Union participated in this repression, as a way to root out, again, leadership, cults, corruption, and oppositionists. In other words, it seems to me it's very difficult to draw a line from Stalin's authoritarianism, and there was aspects of Stalin's authoritarianism, to draw a line from Stalin's authoritarianism to the collapse of the Soviet Union. In fact, when you look at the accomplishments of the Soviet Union under Stalin, industrialization, collectivization of agriculture, defeat of the Nazis, rebuilding the country in 4 years or so after World War II, the 1936 Constitution, the Nationalities Program, the democratic upsurge in the trade union in 1937, the increasing standards of living, etc. This does not seem to jibe with a demoralized and demobilized people. In fact, it seems to me very the opposite. These things could not have been accomplished without a mobilized people and an involved people. And I think that this, by the way, explains why, if you look at Soviet polls today, Stalin ranks as the most popular person in Soviet history, while Gorbachev is the most reviled person in Soviet history. One would not expect these polls to turn out this way if Stalin had been demoralizing them and demobilizing them. So, not surprisingly, I don't find these two criticisms of our book too persuasive. And let me end with this question. If these ideas that the Soviet Union collapsed because of backwardness or because of Stalin are so unpersuasive, why are they so popular? And I think they're popular for this reason. Because a lot of people on the left want to turn their back on the greatest accomplishment of the working class in the history of the world. They're tired of trying to defend it. And our book does that. And plus, it represents the backwardness idea and the blame Stalin idea, represents an accommodation with the leading imperialist ideologies of anti-communism and anti-Stalinism. In this sense, at the level of history, at the level of ideology, it represents the very kind of opportunism that Gorbachev represented in practice in the Soviet Union in the 1980s. With this, let me turn it over to my colleague.
Can you hear me? Roger had the hard part explaining our thesis and explaining the two major criticisms from the left, namely the underdevelopment of the productive forces in 1917 and so-called Stalin deformation. I have an easier job. I just have to discuss one or two things. The question that everybody asked us as we showed our book and explained our book to various audiences, and also a story about our recent trip to Cuba, where it has now been, the book has now been translated, Socialismo Tradicionado, into Spanish, and it is getting considerable discussion in Cuban political circles. This is connected, by the way, it may seem like a digression on Cuba, but it's connected to our book. I also want to finish off by discussing a concept which we developed. I'm not sure we originated it, the concept of opportunism in socialist construction. By the way, I'm not sure I'll go 45 minutes, and that's probably a good thing, because I realize I'm the last obstacle between you and dinner. So, the question. Everybody asks us, ordinary people, people who were Marxists, communists, people who were friends of the Soviet Union, were deeply troubled by this question. They said, okay, Keeran and Kenny, you say that the destructive policies of Gorbachev brought down the Soviet Union. And you also say that the Soviet socialism was a good system, imperfect, but a good system. Well, if the system was so good, Why didn't the workers and the rank-and-file communists fight for it? We heard this everywhere, and we heard it from people who were already hostile to our thesis, who knew of it and were hostile to it. We heard it from intellectuals who had alternative explanations of the Soviet collapse. But the most troubling thing was that we heard it from rank-and-file communists, activists, left-wingers, good Marxists, who had spent their whole lives defending the Soviet Union and were appalled at the destruction of it in the period 1989-1991. Now, we answered it. There is an answer, but it takes a little time to get through it. First of all, the Soviet people did fight for their system. There are several historians who dwell on this. One of them is Graham Gill from Australia, who did study the mass resistance to Gorbachev's policies in the final years of perestroika. We should point out, however, that those who are enamored of this argument are running the danger of slipping into a logical fallacy. There's something called the argument from silence. And what it means is that, in this case, is that the absence of evidence of mass resistance to Gorbachev's policies is evidence of the absence of such resistance. Now, it is not likely, given the fact that we all depended for our understanding of the Soviet downfall on bourgeois newspapers, by and large, and on the writings of the Sovietologist profession, it's quite likely that we would not have a lot of information about the degree of mass resistance. The profession of Sovietology, at least in my country, basically existed to denigrate the Soviet Union and to defame it and to distort its reality. And similarly, since 1917, the bourgeois media have never given an honest account of Soviet socialism. Moreover, there was a feature of Gorbachev's policies that disempowered the Soviet working class, and it's not usually noted, that Gorbachev's political policy was to introduce elements of bourgeois democracy that were largely meaningless, and at the same time undermine the meaningful forms of socialist democracy that had been evolved in the Soviet Union over 40 years. And so, for example, he created the Congress of People's Deputies, which was essentially a bourgeois parliament, and very rapidly it became a show. It delivered no meaningful policies to benefit the people of the Soviet Union. But meanwhile, he and Yakovlev, his advisor, were undermining all the classical techniques and institutions of socialist democracy. So, for example, the Soviet practice of using newspapers as ombudsmen, as well as news sources, was undermined. Vesting trade unions with powers over workers' rights and labor conditions and production norms and the disposition of social funds. The Soviets, the production committees, the community assemblies, the governing committees of large residential complexes, and other party and government bodies, all of these were demolished. So the very means by which the Soviet people had traditionally expressed their political viewpoints were eliminated. There's another point, which is that there is a more difficult question. Roger touched on this, why didn't the healthy forces in the CPSU have the strength as they did in 1929 with Bukharin and 1964 with Khrushchev to defeat the opportunist trends that would have been profoundly damaging? And there is an answer, and that is in the 30 years, and this is the core of our thesis, in the 30 years before Gorbachev, the second economy, the black market, had strengthened the worst elements in the CPSU, and the corruption and opportunism had reached the highest levels of the CPSU by 1985, and then it got worse. Now, I want to make an abrupt transition to what might seem to be a digression and discuss Cuba, because we came back from a trip to Cuba in February this year, two months ago, and you all know that Avante published O Socialismo Traído back in 2008, and the Cubans published Socialismo Traicionado in 2014 of this year. So once again, the Portuguese were in the vanguard of the Iberian working class. So we went there not only for the book launch, but also to do an update of an article we had written 3 years before. Where is the update going? Where is Cuba going? And it was at the initial stages of the update, the actualización, but 3 years have passed, and we interviewed trade unionists, we interviewed policymakers, intellectuals, leaders of the women's movement, people who had Cuban journalists, American journalists, resident in Cuba, and so forth. We interviewed everybody we could. And we are in the process of producing a report, but I'd like to give you a preview of some of our conclusions. And let me start by, let me explain that the book, the person who almost single-handedly ensured that the book would be published in Spanish at long last was Ramon Labanino. Ramon Labanino is one of the Cuban Five. He is still in prison in Ashland, Kentucky, unjustly, of course, still facing at least 10 years. But he's not only is a heroic man, he's a brilliant man, and he read our book in English, and he began a personal crusade to get the Cuban publishing authorities to translate it and publish it. And that's how this book emerged. And Ramon was quite explicit about his motives for doing this, because here's what he says in the prologue to our book. We were very honored to have a prologue from him. He said, "In the historical moment in which our country lives, when we put in place new guidelines for action to perfect and update our economic system, socialism betrayed helps us to be alert and vigilant in order to avoid errors and weaknesses that could bring us to failure. Therefore, I applaud the decision of Nuevo Milenio to publish it in our country. Thanks also to the authors for delivering to us a weapon of war in the colossal battle of ideas in which our country and the whole world live." Now, in that very explicit statement of his own motivations, he's raising an idea, namely the question of the applicability of our thesis to other socialist countries. As you know, Cuba is undergoing this update. It really got underway seriously in 2011, although there had been earlier steps. It involves a transfer of about 20% of the state workforce to the non-state sector, and that non-state sector will include cooperatives and self-employment and small-scale private enterprise. Are comparisons possible between the Soviet Union and Cuba? Well, Ramon thinks so, and we agree. Even though there are obvious historical and political and geographical differences, and one difference is the severity of the US blockade, which is now in its 6th decade. But there are also similarities between Cuba and the Soviet Union. Both essentially are socialist economies, planned, publicly owned. Both had a big problem of black markets, or second economy, as we say. It was worse in the USSR. They share other problems. All socialist economies in the 20th century developed problems with motivating workers, problems of bureaucracy, red tape. There were problems with rationing and delays and lines and all the problems that essentially arose from the imperialist encirclement and pressure on the socialist countries, which continues to this day. But the most important difference between the Cuban reforms and perestroika, the actualización and perestroika, is the fact that the Cuban reforms involve massive rank-and-file discussions and deliberations and consultations with the Cuban working class. Let me just mention the extent of this quickly. The democratic discussion in Cuba involved this. After a year of discussion and revision of the initial Communist Party of Cuba guidelines by the people as a whole in study groups and workplaces and neighborhoods and trade unions and other venues, the guidelines were then discussed in the provinces. In April 2001, they were discussed and revised by the Sixth Party Congress itself. Many changes occurred in this process. For example, the redeployment of 500,000 workers, the original proposal was reduced after discussion to 300,000. Now the guidelines have been now turned into law and regulation by the National Assembly of People's Power. But the whole process, and there are a lot of other details, I could give you the numbers of meetings held in all these places, but the whole process is a dramatic illustration of the Cuban government's search for active popular participation in the reforms. Nothing like this happened in Gorbachev's Soviet Union. I'd like to finally wrap up by discussing the question of, is Ramon correct? Does our thesis have applicability in other countries? A key concept that we developed in our book was the concept of socialism, opportunism in socialist construction. Now, I know I have an audience here of very good leftists, and you've read the works of Lenin, many of you. If you read the works of Lenin, he discusses opportunism non-stop. He pays attention to its diagnosis and to its identification and to its exposing it and to ferreting it out and to fighting it and to fighting people who held opportunist views. It was an essential part of his thinking and his political life. Somehow, within the international communist movement, that focus on opportunism began to fade in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. And well, let me just read quickly this point. Marxists define opportunism as an unnecessary and unprincipled retreat under the pressure of a class enemy. In any struggle, however, in any war, retreats are necessary. And so the question of necessity always hinges on a factual estimate. What is the actual balance of forces? Does a retreat lay the groundwork for a later advance, or is it just an easy way out? So disagreement can arise over what is opportunism and what is not opportunism simply because there's a different factual assessment. And we argued in Socialism Betrayed that in the context of building Soviet socialism, in the 30 years before Gorbachev, opportunism took the form of an unnecessary accommodation with capitalism, both domestic and foreign. It also sometimes appeared as an evolutionary or a complacent respecting of realities, rather than a struggle to change realities. It was a one-sidedly evolutionary approach to building socialism. It yielded to objective circumstances. It sought a quick and easy route to socialism by the path of least resistance. This was especially notable in the Khrushchev era, but in the Khrushchev era and after, opportunism tended to overestimate the automatic nature of building the new system. It overemphasized the buildup of productive forces. It became a socialism of the productive forces, and it downplayed the need to perfect the relations of production. And so in three main waves, under Khrushchev, Kosygin, and Gorbachev, Soviet policymakers introduced capitalist mechanisms and capitalist institutions into the Soviet economy. Now, not every backward step is opportunism. And so, for example, the NEP, which Roger referred to, in the 1920s entailed backward steps to markets, to petty commodity production in the countryside, to foreign investment, but it was not opportunist because it was necessary. Perestroika was opportunist because undoubtedly the Soviet Union needed reform of the party, the economic system, the political system, but perestroika entailed 5 unnecessary policies of extreme opportunist retreat: the liquidation of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the handover of the media to anti-socialist forces, the wholesale privatization of the planned publicly owned economy, beginning under Gorbachev and climaxing with Yeltsin, the unleashing of nationalist separatism, and the surrender to US imperialism. So the question in evaluating the Cuban economic reforms is the Cuban update necessary? Is there any alternative? And we concluded, after a lot of interviews and careful discussion, that it is necessary. Because from 2008 to the present, the international economic crisis has hammered the Cuban economy. Export markets have slumped. The special period, or at least the worst aspects of the special period, are over. The hungry 90s are behind Cuba, but living standards have only risen a bit. And it's also the case that the blockade from the US is going to, after the Cubans were very patient and waiting for 2 years for Obama to make up his mind, and he'd made up his mind, and he's going to continue the blockade. So they were very patient before they decided that they needed to do this internal reform. And finally, external circumstances are not totally favorable either, nor are they stable. For example, Venezuela's Bolivarian revolution and all the positive changes in Latin America that flow from it is by no means fully consolidated. Similarly, another example from a friendly Latin American country, Brazil, which is run by a social democratic government, financed the new container port at Mariel. But, and that's a welcome development, but social democratic governments come and go. So Cuba has to seize every possible opportunity to increase output from existing internal reserves through productivity gains. No perfect solutions exist for Cuba, only a choice among less bad solutions. But a failure to undertake the necessary reforms would also entail risks, and those risks are much greater. Suppose the Cuban government let the black market grow without trying to tame it and tax it and regulate it. Suppose it let the corruption born of the necessity of a tourism-driven economy and the dual currency, suppose that were left undisturbed. Suppose the labor reserves in the state sector, that because they deliberately kept employment higher than it ought to have been in order to get people through the special period and maintain incomes, suppose that were left undisturbed and overmanned public enterprises so that the state sector remained with serious permanent deficiencies in efficiency. Does all of this amount to necessity? Well, clearly, and we agree, the Cuban government thinks so. In December 2010, Raul Castro expressed the government's sense of necessity when he said, "We either rectify things or we run out of time, and we continue to skirt the abyss and we sink." That's pretty strong language. Let me get to my conclusions. The Cuban update is not opportunism, it is not perestroika, it is more like the NEP. It is a necessary adaptation to adverse conditions. It is a temporary adaptation to adverse conditions. And the Cubans have changed their economic model 4 or 5 times since 1959. So they're not, and this is simply the latest rectification. Finally, the essential difference between Cuba and the actualización and perestroika is that the search for the active participation of the Cuban people is the best guarantee that the reform process in Cuba will not go wrong. As we all know, and I end here, I think everybody in this room who knows anything about 20th century history knows that the collapse of Soviet socialism was probably the greatest calamity of the 20th century. And you can hardly point to very many good things coming out of the Soviet collapse. But I think we probably can say that one good thing coming out of it was that the Cuban Revolution has learned the lessons of the Soviet collapse. Thank you.